Chapter 6. Coping with Pain. I started reading the Bible more on my own, and I became accustomed to living in the shack. I had begun to receive support from my relatives on the hill. My cousin Carl and his lovely wife Elizabeth also pitched in. They welcomed me to eat whenever I was at their home. There were the times when it was very apparent when I had worn out my welcome with family on the hill. It took a lot to get to that point because I was practically living on the hill at one time. There were many instances when Medea and Andrew were cooking, and I smelled it from across the street. On one occasion, assuming I would be eating once the food was prepared, I would work out, lifting weights until it was dinner time. Once the food was done, Andrew would call me to come to the porch to get my plate. As he called me, Medea would be on the porch calling the dogs and cats to feed them leftovers. So we would all hurry to Medea's porch together, the dogs, the cats, and I alongside them. To my surprise, Andrew handed me a plate of cold grits that had been cooked several days ago. The grits were from the same portion of food Medea was using to feed the cats and dogs. I looked at the plate, and I looked at the dogs and cats eating the grits from the ground. I threw the plate onto the ground and told the dogs and cats they had extras today. There were too many times when I ate the same thing as the stray dogs and cats. Normally, I would have eaten those grits, as I did many days before, but this time I had another alternative. I walked about a half hour through the pasture to the blueberry orchard and ate blueberries. I was so hungry, I didn't even pick or clean them. I ate them straight from the vine. I nearly choked on leaves and other foliage as I swallowed the hardly chewed blueberries. I ate all I could and walked back to my shack. My shirt, hands, and face were covered with blueberry particles and juices. I got some hot water from Andrew, poured it into my foot tub, and soaped my body. After I finished bathing, I retired for the evening and fell asleep. With a growling stomach awaking me in the middle of the night, I was perplexed. Stuffing my stomach with blueberries did little to cure my hunger, and I now regretted throwing away my grits. I observed a patch of blackberries that grew near a trash pile in front of my shack, and I ate from that blackberry patch. This was an everyday practice to prevent myself from starving. I grew weary of hoping and wondering if she was going to allow me to eat a meal. I didn't know if she was going to feed me the leftover scraps she set aside for the dogs, or if anything at all. I became proactive and began to look around at my surroundings for things to eat. I realized that there was a pear tree in my backyard and a fig tree in Medea's backyard. On the days I was too exhausted from not having eaten to walk a half an hour to the blueberry orchard, I would gather pears from the pear tree. On the days Medea was gone, I would sneak into her backyard and eat some of the figs from the fig tree. I had somewhat of a variety of things to choose from, although none of them would completely satisfy my hunger, but I was happy to have something to eat. That's how I normally ate during those years. I rotated between eating pears and blackberries that grew wild in my front yard. I indulged in endless raids of Mr. Coase's blueberry orchard, and the occasional figs I lifted from Medea's fig tree were tasty. I dreaded the slop Medea set aside for the stray dogs and cats. She divided it proportionately between the animals and me. Recalling a time when I hadn't eaten a meal in days, I saw Medea and Andrew on the porch with some day-old grits. Andrew called me over. I held back from the best of my ability from bursting into a full sprint. My counterparts weren't so patient. They all panted and ran towards the porch to eat the slop they were throwing on the ground for them. He gave me stale yellow grits to eat, but that time, I ate them. Playing football caused me to burn tons of energy, and that caused me to be hungrier than normal. This was another reason why playing football became burdensome to me. Once, before my first football game, the coach called us into the cafeteria to eat. I looked around at my teammates as we made our way to the cafeteria. I asked one of them how often we did this. He said we ate extra food before every game. I was praising the Lord silently as we entered the cafeteria. I sat down and ate more than all of the biggest boys on the team, including those who weighed over 300 pounds. Whenever we traveled to an away game, we ate at Burger King after the game, and that was a big help for me. I needed to eat whenever and wherever I could. When I was at Medea's house during one of her good spells, I noticed she kept a lot of coins in her bedroom and a dresser drawer. I started breaking into her house to steal those coins and walk to the fast bar to buy food to eat. I would stroll down to the store, planning in my head what I was going to buy. The store didn't have meat or produce. They mainly had canned goods and microwavable snacks. More often than not, I would buy 2 Little Debbie zebra cakes and a fudge round sandwich cake with the coins I stole. At times, I purchased honey buns and Vienna sausages, and I always bought an ice cold Dr. Pepper to wash it all down. Once I purchased my snacks, I would hurry home as quickly as I could to eat them. I normally purchase a few dollars worth of snacks with some old valuable coins, probably worth several $100 if I sold to a collector or bank. Looking into the window of my past, I could see a young, innocent boy hurrying down the street to a shack he calls home to eat snacks bought with his grandmother's stolen coins. I can see that little boy sitting on a blanket next to his bed on the floor, joyfully ripping open his snacks. He hadn't eaten in days, but he was abused daily. All he ever hoped for was love. He cracks his Dr. Pepper open halfway so that it would last longer and washes down the snacks he ate. He grins with a large smile upon his face and discards the empty wrappings. Brandon is bowing down on his knees and begins to pray. Dear God, my Father, bless me. I pray that I don't have to live like this forever. I pray, God, that my life gets better. I thank you for the food I just ate, Father. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. When I first joined the football team, I quit several times because of my many contributing hardships in my life. But once I learned the team was given extra food and ate at Burger King after away games, I played the entire year without quitting. I never ate at Burger King prior to going there after our away games. The first time I ate at Subway was after practice, and my friend Andre went there to get a sandwich on our way to Bible study. He asked if I was coming inside with him after he parked his car. I sighed and looked at him and said, Nah, man, I'm all right. I don't need anything to eat. I'll wait until I get home and eat then. Andre walked into Subway and stood in the line, waiting to place his order. I looked at him and the other patrons inside, selecting the toppings they wanted on their sandwiches. For some reason, Andre walked back outside and asked me to come in, offering to buy me something to eat. I laughed and insisted on staying in the car, and thanked him for being so generous. I can't remember Andre's exact words, but he said something to let me know that he knew I was hungry, and I didn't have to be ashamed if I didn't have money to pay for my food. I walked into Subway with him and was deeply confused. I didn't know how to place my order. I embarrassed myself by standing in front of the line where people were paying for their food. Once I got in the right line, I was puzzled because I didn't know what toppings came on a Subway sandwich. I was concerned about being charged extra for the toppings, so I only asked for the toppings Andre got on his sandwich. That same day, I discovered I could have ordered as many toppings as I wanted, excluding extra meat or cheese for no additional cost. I had a foot-long meatball marinara sub, my favorite sandwich there, with lettuce, tomatoes, jalapeno peppers, and Parmesan cheese. That brings back some good memories. One of my best memories while living in the abandoned shack is when my brother Charles and two of his friends Mark and Sean came over to visit me. It was late in the evening and I was lying down in bed, but awake. I heard a car pull into my driveway. It was Charles and his friends carrying a bag full of beer. I was shocked because no one had ever visited me. Besides, I was too embarrassed for anyone to visit. They all walked in. What's up, man? What up, nigga? Shit, just chilling, we said to one another. We gave fist pounds, smiled, and laughed while greeting one another. I started to get dressed after they sat down. I assumed they came to pick me up and go hang at their place. After I was dressed, they continued to talk, laugh, and drink beer. At that point, I realized they came to visit me, and I was subsequently happy. I lit all of my lamps and candles so they could have enough light. I spared no expense for those guys. I took good care of them. I even lit a few candles I had hidden in the event of Medea taking my lamps again. I moved my foot tub to another room with a few other things so everyone could sit comfortably. We talked, drank, and laughed the night away. I can only assume that I was a good host because they all left cheerfully hours later. That was the first and only time I experienced anything like that. No one referred to the fact that we were in an old abandoned house. No one complained about the horrible odor. No one commented or complained about sitting in a shack without lights or water. I followed them to the door as they exited, hoping the night would never end so they wouldn't have to leave. That was a moment when I felt normal, like everyone else. The next day, I woke up and went to school. I tried my best to understand the things my teachers talked about in class. I had been dropping in and out of school for so long that I hadn't learned the basic material needed to understand high school coursework. One of my favorite times of the school day was when the school bell sounded and class was dismissed. I rode the bus to the trap and got off there. I walked a few blocks to visit my mom at the women's jail. Before I went there, I gave some random guy cash to buy me a can of beer. He went into a corner store, bought the beer, and gave it to me. I bought 2 cans of Dr. Pepper and poured one of them out. I took the empty can and poured the beer into it. I bent the head of a sewing needle and used it to close the Dr. Pepper can. I poured some Dr. Pepper from the second can around the lip of the can that contained the beer, and I placed both cans in the same hand with the partially open one on top. I pretended to drink out of it when I walked onto the jail grounds. The guards patted me down and casually glanced at the Dr. Pepper cans. I walked into the jail and waited for my mother to be summoned to the jail yard or visiting area. This was a surprise visit. She walked down and hugged and kissed me. My baby, she said. I miss you so much, Brandon. I miss you too, Mama, I said, and gently passed her the can of Dr. Pepper. She smiled and said, You know I don't drink Dr. Pepper, boy. We walked outside into the jail yard and sat down at a wooden picnic table. This was the same table we always sat at and played spades or dominoes. I bought her a pack of cigarettes and some snacks from commissary. She pulled out a pack of cards and we started playing spades. After some time, she finally got thirsty and opened the partially open can of Dr. Pepper. My mother looked at me startled and said, This can already open, Brandon. I mirrored her surprised look and said, I know, Mama, just drink it. She placed the can to her mouth and reluctantly took a sip. While wearing a huge smile on her face, she said, This ain't Dr. Pepper. This tastes like beer. She was very surprised and inquired about how I got the beer in the can and resealed it so well. More than anything, she was happy to enjoy good tasting beer. We began to play spades and later on, one of her friends joined in. I had a good time and I imagine my mother did too. It was just like old times before Mother got arrested. Mother was playing cards and drinking her beer. Once she finished the beer, she gave me the can and started to worry that the guards would smell the beer on her breath. I told her not to worry about that and passed her a can of sardines. I bought them earlier to mask the odor of the alcohol. She ate the sardines and marveled at me. Brandon, you are something else. She looked at me with those bright eyes of hers. My mother was utterly amazed. For her next visit, I offered to bring her some Mad Dog 2020 or some of her favorite wines, but she discouraged me from doing so and warned me that I could get arrested for bringing alcohol into the jail. After an hour or more had passed, our visit reached its end. We walked to the exit gate and hugged and kissed each other. Mother whispered that she loved me and I told her I loved her too. I walked away from the jail compound and saw Mother standing by the fence in the yard next to the roadway as she usually did after a visit. She was smiling. I looked on at her and waved. I told her how much I anticipated our next visit. I told her I was going to invite Charles to play her and her cellmate in a game of spades. Charles' ass can't play spades, she said. I walked around town until I saw my Uncle Andrew drive by, and I motioned to get his attention. He looked over and saw me standing on the curb, wearing a ridiculous grin on my face. He pulled over to give me a ride. I got into the car and began to talk to him about my visit with Mama. I told him she was doing well and that I was whipped horribly in a few hands of spades by Mama and a couple ladies who were also serving time. We arrived at Medea's house and I exited the car. I walked across the street to read the Bible as I told Mother I planned to do since I made it home. Now, here comes my little sisters and brothers bolting into my shack from nowhere. Brad, how's Mama doing? Andrew told us you saw Mama. Calm down now before you give yourselves a heart attack. After I got them settled, I told them all about my visit with Mother, minus the beer incident. I told them our mother was building her body with lean muscle as she had done in previous incarcerations. They visited Mother as often as I did, but they always liked to gather around and listen to me tell stories about my visits with her. I formed a very strong bond with my siblings and they held me in the highest regard. I dreaded the Christmas holiday and became very embarrassed every Christmas day. I absolutely hated my birthday. I never received anything for either occasion. Every Christmas, all my peers at school wore their new clothes or boasted about the gifts they had at home. I would stand there and pretend not to listen as they discussed their holiday gifts. Each year passed and I never received a thing. There were times when my mother would put together what money she had and buy us some gifts, which were received with great appreciation because they came from her. Medea and Andrew cooked a huge Christmas dinner every year. I thought I could look forward to Christmas dinner, but Medea stopped allowing me to eat Christmas dinner with them. The one time a year I could go inside Medea's house and eat dinner with my brother and sisters had been taken away. My youngest sister, Star, boldly devised a plan for me to eat dinner one Christmas all by herself. She was only 7 at the time. I never forget that Christmas evening when she came stumbling across the street, nearly falling down, carrying a big plate piled high with food and dessert. As I observed her walking, the first thing I thought was, Christmas dinner? Could this be Christmas dinner? I received the plate from Star and thanked her. She smiled and ran back across the street without wasting any time. I thought for a second that Medea sent Star to give me the Christmas dinner. After a few hours passed, I found out that Star had given me her Christmas dinner. Medea had threatened to starve Star if she ever gave me her food again. I lay in bed, happy to finally have a full stomach. I looked out my window across the street and listened for Star. I was a little worried about her and wanted to know that she was okay. I was afraid Medea might have beaten her or done something crazy. I lay back down across my bed and folded my hands behind my head. I thanked Star the next morning while walking to the bus stop, but I encouraged her not to do anything like that again. There was another Christmas when Star surprised me a second time. It happened in almost the same manner as the first. I was lifting weights on the bench press in front of my shack and Star walked over. She told me she had something for me, so I threw the weights back onto the weight rack and leaned forward asking, "What is it, Star?" She smiled again and said, "I have a Christmas gift for you," and handed me a folded piece of paper. It read, "Happy Xmas to my brother Brandon from your sister, Star," written with green and red markers. I was happy and well pleased, but what she told me afterward made my heart melt even more. My little sister told me that she made me that gift because she knew I never got anything and she wanted me to have a gift too, not to imply that she was shy with gifts. What little gifts, mostly charitable, she did receive were remarkably underwhelming. But at her young age, she didn't know the difference, or at least that's what I like to think. I got off the bench and hugged and thanked her. I held on to that piece of paper through the years and still have it today. That was one of the most thoughtful, kind gestures I ever received, by far. I got along pretty well with Trisha and most of my family on the Hill. She supported and encouraged me to finish school and also to play football. She always told me that I was special and that I had a story to tell. I liked Trisha very much, and speaking with her was a sort of therapy for me. She held a consistent role in my life, but whenever I seemed to wear out my welcome, I would slack up on going to the Hill as often. No matter whose house I slept at, I always remembered that my old shack was my safe haven. I started bonding with the guys on the football team, and that was my first time getting close with my peers at school since I was 7. I normally kept to myself as much as I could, so no one would learn anything about my personal life. The coaches and my teammates started calling me Brandon the Great or the Great One. I can't begin to explain how much I enjoyed hearing everyone chant those words. It started after a game I played well in. I had multiple sacks and many solo tackles. Most teams we played always had their guys double team me, usually at nose guard and defensive tackle. I would defend against a guard or offensive tackle, but many times I would defend both. I used to sit in the back of the bus and rap whenever we traveled for an away game. That was a fun pastime most of my teammates enjoyed. There would be someone beating on the seats and windows to make a beat. Someone beatboxed, and another would sing the hook. It's the motherfucking Brandon, 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 Brandon. Everyone shouted systematically. I would start rapping my heart out, saying anything that came to mind. Everyone noted me as being an excellent rapper, so I guess whatever I was doing worked. We normally rapped after our away games, even if we were defeated. School was getting a little better. It seemed being a part of the football team helped me to cope. I became close to the teacher I was most afraid of, Miss Phillips. She taught English and was known for giving scolding lectures to all the troubled students who didn't seem to care about getting an education. She referenced me as Mr. Williams, and she had a sweet voice. I was sitting in the classroom daydreaming one day and wasn't listening to what she was teaching. "Mr. Williams, what do you think about that?" she asked me. I was shocked because none of the other teachers bothered with me. They had written me off as a lost cause. Very few of them ever asked me questions in class. I corrected my slouch posture and leaned forward, trying to look as alert as I could. I replied, "Ma'am, can you repeat your question?" Miss Phillips said, "Hell, Mr. Williams, I repeated the question several times already. So why don't you go ahead and explain to the class your take on this matter?" Everyone stared at me, fully aware that I didn't have a clue about what Miss Phillips was talking about. I continued to stare and raise my eyebrows as if I was pondering the hardest problem known to man. Miss Phillips quickly grew tired of my stunt and told me that by the time I responded, we would all be dead and Glendale High School would be closed down. She moved on to another student who responded with the correct answer. Miss Phillips asked me if that was the answer I was thinking of, and I nodded my head. Of course she didn't believe me. The principal, Mr. Albert King, also became a very good support of me. For the first time in my life, graduating high school became my goal, and it was within sight after being promoted to the 11th grade. However, I reverted to selling crack on and off. I sold weed to some of my teammates, but I toned down my bad boy persona a lot. At one point, I slept in a different place almost every night. But now I spent most of my nights at my shack. There were times when I ate at Trisha's house and some of my younger relatives asked why. There were occasions when Trisha and her family looked on in astonishment as I ate. Those moments were the weirdest for me, causing me to become even more embarrassed about my life. I had to beg for food from almost everyone I knew. Trisha's house was the main place where I ate during that time. My late cousin Maurice would feed me at his house and even told me I could live with him. One day, he and I were hanging around outside of his house because he didn't have his key. He asked if I had eaten anything. I shook my head. He would have fed me that day, as he did on a couple of other occasions, but we were locked out. I looked in his yard and saw some ripe watermelons growing. Maurice noticed me watching the watermelons and offered me one. I told him jokingly that since he insisted, I'd have one. I grabbed the biggest watermelon I could find and took a seat on the back of his truck. "Well, are you going to eat it?" he asked. I told him I didn't have any utensils to cut it open or eat it with. Maurice grabbed a watermelon, held it about waist high, and dropped it onto the ground. It busted open perfectly into two halves. He picked up both halves of the watermelon and handed one over to me. After learning his technique, I must have burst open nearly a half dozen watermelons and ate them in the back of his truck. Maurice told me I could sleep overnight at his house whenever I didn't have a place to stay. I told him he should check with his parents first, in which he responded that they wouldn't notice me because they had so many people living there. I thought hard about Maurice's offer, but I never took him up on it because I didn't want to cause a problem. I disparagingly missed my cousin. He, as many of today's youth, was a victim of pointless violence. A guy gunned him down, but it isn't totally clear what actually happened. Some of my family members told me that he had an argument with the baby daddy and estranged boyfriend of a woman he was dating. The guy and my cousin allegedly had a heated exchange of words one day at the woman's house. This resulted in my cousin pulling out his gun and firing in the direction of the guy as he ran for cover. I was told that my cousin didn't have any real intention of shooting the guy, but only wanted to scare him. The next day, the guy came back with the gun and murdered my cousin without argument at the woman's house. But nobody can really say what happened, other than those involved. My success in football was realized when LSU coach Jerry DiNardo came to watch me practice. I had started receiving mail from various colleges that were interested in recruiting me for their football programs. This was an aha moment for me because this contradicted everything my family had told me. How can someone as important as Jerry DiNardo take interest in me if I'm a complete failure, as the condescending five proclaimed? I always knew they were ignorant people and I never really listened to their nonsense rhetoric, although I must say most, if not all, of those malicious and hateful things they said hamper my confidence. I believed nothing good was supposed to happen to me. I only expected to experience momentary periods of happiness. I never expected much more than that for myself. I never realized how much they impacted my subconscious until years later. As I continued to progress in school and football, my self-esteem did also. My bond with Miss Phillips flourished, and she became a lifelong confidant. She strongly encouraged me to complete school, and on one instance, she gave me financial support. For the longest time, I felt like my life was on autopilot, destined for destruction, and I didn't care. But now I know differently. It is quite profound the way emotion, self-esteem, love, and self-value works, or the lack thereof affects us. I became more interested in the lovely young ladies of Glendale High, but shied away from them. I was too afraid to allow someone to grow close because they would discover my life as it really was. Therefore, I missed a lot of opportunities for companionship during my high school years. I continued to visit my mother regularly. We spent many days in the yard of the jail playing spades, laughing, and talking about the good old days. I established a few bonds with some of the women who were incarcerated with her. Meanwhile, The chaos that ensued living in my shack only got worse. Subpar living while trying to attain a high school education would be a difficult feat for anyone. The ridicule and verbal abuse from the condescending five worsened. Several years earlier, my older cousin Daniel did something I'll never forget. He was in his 20s and I was 13. I hadn't started living in the shack yet, and I was still living with Medea, Andrew, my grandfather, and my siblings. Daniel came to Medea's house to borrow some money from her. He was in need because he had spent his on various women he courted outside of his marriage. Medea and I had an argument earlier that day, and she was still upset about it. Daniel came in the house, and I greeted him with a smile. He spoke to me and Andrew, then Daniel stormed into Medea's bedroom and attempted to sweet-talk her into giving him some money, as he had done many times. Medea refused to loan him the money and tried to send him away. Before he left her room, she told him about the argument she and I had earlier. Daniel capitalized on the moment to change Medea's heart about giving him the money. He walked in front of me while I was sitting down and stood there for a moment with a blank stare. Without warning, he struck me in my face with his fist. The blow hurt my sense of being and value as a person more than it did physically. I looked up at him from my chair, and a single tear of surprise rolled down the right side of my face. I considered trying to fight him back to defend myself, but I couldn't believe my cousin had done this. I openly admired and embraced him, second only to my mother. He remained standing over me in the same position he was before he struck me. I can only assume he was about to strike me a second time before Andrew rushed over and grabbed him. Daniel, stop, Andrew screamed. Don't hit Brad like that. He's a child. Daniel walked away. Much like my abused mother, I wiped away the single tear that formed a stream from my swollen face. I was abused as a child, but I was afraid to tell anyone about it. I was ashamed and embarrassed. I felt like somehow it was my fault or that this sort of thing was supposed to happen to me. Medea walked into the living room, saw my bruised face, and smiled. She looked at Daniel and invited him back into her bedroom. It was clear that Medea decided to give Daniel the money because he assaulted me, and expressing a strong sense of hatred for me had earned Daniel his reward. There was another time that same year when James was about to attack me. I was in Andrew's bedroom watching television when James and his wife confronted me. James asked me to step outside so that he could assault me. I told him that I was standing right in front of him and asked why I had to go outside. He started to curse, yell, and hurl hurtful insults as I stood motionless. His wife stood behind him to lend her support, approving of her husband assaulting me. I began to pace the floor and said nothing while James shouted. I prepared myself mentally for the moment he struck so I could try to defend myself. After several minutes of making threats to harm me, James and his wife walked out of Andrew's room. She embraced him as they walked away as if he had done an honorable deed, as if he was a prize fighter being escorted from the ring. I sat down, nodded my head and sighed deeply, attempting to ignore the pain. My heart was hurt. I was deeply grieved and tired of being everybody's punching bag. My family was relentless in their physical and verbal abuse, but after the age of 16, the physical abuse ceased, and so did the threats. I suppose this was due to my change of attitude and body development. The neglect as well as the mental and emotional abuse continued, but at least I wasn't being beaten anymore. At present day, many years later, my mother and I have somehow remained a topic of discussion. I was always aware of the fact that they hoped I failed in life and that my mother never got her life back on track. My younger cousin, Crystal, daughter of James, confirmed this for me one day. I received the most disturbing text from her asking why I hated her and my family, wondering if it was because of the abuse and hardships I suffered during my childhood. This text was random and I didn't have any idea where the origin of the topic developed, but the most telling part is that Crystal was only a small child during most of my sufferings. She was too young to understand what was going on in my life. I reasoned that the condescending five were the origin of this text message discussion I was having with Crystal, who I love and embrace dearly. I would like to share with you a story about an old man who hated his pet dog, Spunk. Spunk was very loving and protective of his master. Often, the old man rewarded Spunk's obedience with a swift kick in the butt. Then the old man would turn his back, laughing as Spunk hobbled away with his tail between his legs. The old man beat Spunk and starved him too. Spunk was so malnourished that, although he was about 2 years old, he appeared to be a 6-month-old pup. Despite the never-ending torture and ridicule Spunk received from his master, he loved the old man tirelessly. After many years of being beaten, starved, and emotionally abused, Spunk ran away. When the old man learned that Spunk ran away, he was deeply saddened and became very angry. He told all his neighbors that his good-for-nothing, ungrateful dog ran away. The old man grieved and was distraught. He told everyone in town how much he loved Spunk. Spunk received word of his master's outcries, so he decided to return home. Spunk, seeing his master seated on the porch, leaped into his lap, only to be driven forcefully to the ground. The old man held Spunk down by thrusting his foot into Spunk's neck. He picked up a nearby branch and nearly beat Spunk to death with it. One day, a nice person passing by saw a battered and bloody Spunk and rescued him. He took Spunk away without the master's knowledge. The old man simply thought Spunk had run away again. The old man soon started spreading more rumors about how much Spunk hated him and ran away from home again. The truth is, Spunk never hated the old man. In fact, he loved him. The old man loved to hate Spunk and was saddened when he left because he had no one to torture and abuse. He hated Spunk even more for not being the subject of his abuse anymore. The abused dog depicted in this story is me, and the old man is my family. The nice person who stopped and rescued me was Jesus Christ. After several threads of text, I finally relented by telling my younger cousin I'd call her later to finish our discussion. She had a rebuttal for every effort I made in an attempt to reassure her that I did not hate her or my family. I'm not certain if someone put her up to this or if it came in light of hearing unfavorable discussions about me. Either way, her questions confirmed that somewhere out there, the old man is still grieving because Spunk isn't around anymore. I love you, old man, and I'm sure Spunk loves you too. I forgive you for hurting me, and I have long released the grudges and disdain that I held for you during that time. After many years of suffering from abuse, undernourishment, and homelessness, I had finally made it to the 12th grade. It was a miracle. Many of the people who knew my story told me so. Brandon, you could have been murdered, killed someone, or in prison, but you still here, Tricia said. Tricia and Miss Phillips really gave me a lot of confidence in my abilities and helped me discover my value within. I shouted, yes, repeatedly while holding the letter that said I was promoted to the 12th grade. I realized more than ever that the possibility of completing high school was a very realistic one. By this time, I had completely stopped selling drugs, including the occasional marijuana I sold to my teammates. I continued shooting dice and gambling here and there to earn money. I was eating often at almost all of my friends' houses. I learned to rotate between them, being careful not to wear out my welcome as I did once before. I had long discovered going to school regularly was a guarantee I would eat at least twice that day. Not having food to eat wasn't much of an issue anymore, although a long day of football practice would deplete nearly every ounce of energy I had. But I enjoyed the extra meals I received even more as I was on the football team. During my senior year, I developed a deep interest in Afro-American, American, and world history. I read about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Prior to this, I long held that the Underground Railroad was literally a secret passage underground that Tubman used to aid slaves to freedom. I read about it with a sense of pride and enthusiasm for the countless white men and women, some of whom were abolitionists, that suffered, fought, and died to end slavery only to have their descendants, e.g. the Freedom Riders, carry on their fight through equal rights protests and demonstrations alongside their black counterparts. I registered to take the ACT test as my coach instructed me to. I had many prospective universities that were interested in recruiting me for an athletic scholarship, but they all cited that my grade point average of 1.87 was extremely low. Clark State University's coaches Kurt Whitman and Terry Jackson were also interested. One day, I was called into the principal's office during my last school period. I walked into his office and was greeted by a proud Albert King. He asked me to have a seat and introduced me to Terry Jackson. I shook his hand, and he politely joked about possibly being my father. He told me that joke because he and my mother dated back when they were in high school. Mr. King and Coach Jackson got straight to business by telling me that I should consider becoming a part of Clark State University's football program. When I asked about a scholarship, They explained that my grades were too low. They told me I could get financial aid until I improved academically and receive a scholarship afterward. I was happy to hear this news, and the thought of completing high school was received as a miracle. I couldn't imagine going to a university at that time. I thanked them both, and Coach Jackson told me he hoped to see me in Midland soon. I wasn't happy about getting letters and visits from various coaches without having a scholarship, but I really didn't understand the recruiting process. I thought my grades were bad, but shouldn't be a factor on whether or not I received an athletic scholarship. I talked to Major Davidson about this, and he asked me if I had considered joining the Army. He told me that I was a great JROTC cadet, and he felt I'd be a perfect match for the Army. I told him I thought about enlisting into the Marine Corps so I could adopt my younger siblings and become their legal guardian. I spoke to my mother one day while visiting her in jail about adopting my siblings, and she agreed. Medea cursed and was verbally abusive to them. She used to tell my sisters Jess and Star that they were homeless, which was one of the many words Medea invented or simply mispronounced. I believe this word is closely related to being a whore or prostitute. Jess was 12, Star was 9, and Derek was 10. Medea would regularly tell them that they were homeless and that they weren't going to be shit, just like Jackie. There were 3 innocent little children subjected to this abuse, and since Mama was in jail, they had no one to take care of their hair maintenance needs. Medea used to tell my sisters that my younger cousin was better looking than them because she had a lighter complexion. Medea asked Lauren to perm Jess and Star's hair, and to my surprise, she did. My sister's hair was very long, but also thick and coarse because a while had passed since they had a relaxer. I remember both my sisters combing out huge locks of hair. After Lauren relaxed it, they had burns around the edges of their hairlines and on the back of their necks. I was furious because I believe she purposely did that, as her and her daughter Crystal had extremely short hair, not to mention the fact that she hated my sisters. I told my sisters not to allow Lauren to touch their hair again. I felt so sorry for them, and I offered to take care of their hair from that point on. Days later, my sisters had lost almost half their hair. Their hair used to hang below their shoulders, and now it barely hung below their ears. I suppose Jess inquired about how to relax hair because I saw her relaxing Star's hair several months earlier. Medea offered to send them back to Lauren, and they both declined, as I suggested. Jess started relaxing her own hair too. Jess would try to comb and style their hair the best she could for a 12-year-old. I started asking questions to various women about relaxing hair and learning quite a bit. I told my sisters that I would try my best to meet their hair care needs. Shortly after, I started relaxing, setting, washing, conditioning, cutting split ends, rolling, styling, and giving them hot oil treatments in efforts to restore their hair to its original state. I was successful, and eventually their hair grew back as long as it had been once before. Their hair had sheen, bounce, and was very healthy. I was so proud to see them happy with their hair again. As time progressed, my sisters started asking for more difficult hairstyles than I could do. I used to put in French rolls, buns, twists, ponytails, and braids. I decorated their hair age appropriately with barrettes, ribbons, scrunchies, hair clips, and pins as they requested. I used to style their hair according to the latest trend, or I tried desperately to anyway. Eventually, a classmate of mine that was also a daughter of one of Medea's friends started taking care of my sister's hair. I noticed on their birthdays, my siblings normally received a gift of some sort. It wouldn't be anything special, but at least they were getting something. Normally the gifts came from a local charity organization in Glendale, and sometimes from Mama or their fathers. We all had different fathers, though Jess and Star were rumored to have the same father. I never knew my father, but I met the man on 3 occasions. We met once when I was about 6, a second time when I was 13, and the last time I saw him, I was 25. I was mildly satisfied with the charitable gifts they received during the holidays and the underwhelming gifts they received from their parents. I noticed during the Easter holiday, the charity didn't pass out gifts, so they usually ended up not celebrating the holiday. I started buying plastic Easter eggs and filled them with candy and dollar bills. I remember the first Easter I did that. My younger brother and sisters were in awe. They were surprised and joyful when I called them across the street to the compounds of my illustrious shack for an Easter egg hunt. I hid eggs filled with assorted candy and cash everywhere. I also bought my siblings chocolate bunnies and other festive items. I used the money I made from hustling in the trap to fund the Easter egg hunt. I was around 15 or so at that time. I I had always found it amazing how much happiness doing a little wrong could bring your loved ones. Later that day, we had Bible studies and I quizzed them on basic Bible stories afterward. I did this in keeping my mother's tradition. She always studied God's Word with me and my older brother. I was more of a father figure to my siblings than a brother. In fact, my older brother Charles even admired and looked up to me because of my perseverance during the many struggles and hardships of my life. My siblings and I were very close, as we still are today. I struggled with alcohol during the latter part of my middle school years, as well as my freshman and sophomore years in high school. When I went to school after being on the street all night, I found it very hard to focus in class. All I would think about is the ridicule I would face if someone found out I was homeless. I was insecure about the state of my life and with who I was. I hated myself, I hated being poor, and I detested being hated by my family and everyone else. I was so discontent with myself that I was suicidal. Going to school filled with classrooms of happy children saddened me because I was forced to become an adult at 13. I never had the luxury of not worrying and just being a kid. I was introduced to the street life at the young age of 7 and had become a gun-packing certified hustler, gangster, by the age of 13. I grew up very quickly, living the street life, or what some would call a thug's life. But I always wanted to be the kid I really was. Going to school only reminded me of how different my life was from the other kids. So I started drinking Night Train, MD 2020, and white port every morning before I went to school. No pain, no worries, I used to say while tilting my head back to take a sip. Alcohol consumption before going to school was my way of coping with daily stress. I used to get drunk almost every morning before school. Once I had alcohol in my system, I didn't worry about what the other kids had or what I didn't have. I didn't care because I was high and feeling good. The days I went to school intoxicated, I normally would be more social with everyone and I laughed at everything. I often skipped class and I shot dice with a couple guys. Depending on who my teacher was, I shot dice in the back of the classroom while he or she discussed our assignment for the day. I sat in the back of the classroom and had a student in front of me to distract the teacher while I gambled. If I won, I paid the student a small fee, and if the other person won, he paid. There was something in it for all of us, and that's how I influenced others to participate. Needless to say, there always was that stubborn kid in school who had the perfect life but wanted to be down. I pitied the kids like that and didn't associate with them very much unless I was scolding them and telling them how they need to be true to themselves and thankful for their good lives. Life was hard, but my mother and I made the best of it. There was a period in my youth when I bathed and washed my face with bleach. I tried to bleach my skin many times over, desperately hoping to attain a lighter complexion. This came about after being told repeatedly I was too black and too ugly. I walked with a slumped over posture intentionally, hoping not to appear as tall as I was. I began to do so after I was told regularly that I resembled a big black gorilla. I used to dream about grafting hair from the back of my head to the front of my scalp. This was something I vowed to do once I had enough money because of the taunts I received about having a big head. All of the complexes I have developed regarding my appearance and intellectual ability were a direct result of the verbal and physical abuse I received as a child.